Markham Luke, who's a physician and Ph.D. trained at Hopkins, and he's now Chief Medical Officer for the Office of Device Evaluation at the FDA. And instead of the long title that's in the book, he asked me to change it to make it simple: clinical trials and endpoints. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to listen to this. Let me see if I have the forward thing. Okay, great. So I'm here to talk a little bit about FDA. I'm going to start talking a little bit about where I come from. Office of Device Evaluation, which is at the Food and Drug Administration. We're about 400 folks, engineers mostly. We have about 80 medical officers. We're organized into 7 divisions, 5 by clinical specialty and 2 for support. This is a little org chart. We have various divisions. You could probably find your specialty somewhere on this. We've got cardiovascular devices, ophthalmic, neurologic, ear, nose, and throat, reproductive and abdominal devices, surgical, orthopedic, and restorative devices, and anesthesia and general hospital devices. So I'm a gardener. I like watching things grow. It takes a little time, lots of patience. You need to weed a lot and pull out what things don't belong, look at which plants are, how they fit into the general scheme of the garden, and what you want to grow in your garden to make it look good, to have a certain functionality in a particular field. So at FDA, we use a risk-based paradigm. The law gives us the flexibility to calibrate our regulatory approach to the level of potential risk. I'm going to explain a little bit about this risk-based paradigm. I assume most of you know a little bit about how devices are classified, so I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. If you're interested in more specifics, the FDA website is a good resource. Class 1 devices are simple, low-risk devices. They're subject to general controls. Most of these Class 1 devices are exempt from pre-market review and notification. Class 2 are more complex, higher risk. They're subject to general controls and special controls. We use a regulatory tool called pre-market notification, 510K process. We use the standard of substantial equivalence, which I'll explain a little bit. And most of these are cleared on preclinical and animal testing alone, but about 10% of these do require clinical studies, and some of these studies can be fairly extensive. Substantial equivalence is the authority granted to us to put devices on the market based on 510K submissions where we compare new devices to predicate marketed devices. A decision flow sheet, which is fairly complex and is part of our regulations, results in a binary determination of substantial equivalent or not substantial equivalent. And we can go through the flow sheet, but it's like I said, complex, and we probably don't have the time at this time. Class 3 are more complex. These are the highest risk category, and all the Class 3 devices require some amount of clinical testing, including clinical trials. And I'm going to get a little bit into clinical trials soon. Humanitarian device exemptions was mentioned by Dr. Anders. It's for devices targeted at fewer than 4,000 patients per year. And there must be a demonstration of safety, and there's a lower standard of probable benefit versus actual benefit. And that the fact that that probable benefit outweighs the probable risk of those devices. What allows clinical studies to be conducted in the United States for devices, and this is the investigational devices exemption. It allows clinical studies to support a PMA and 510K. This is for significant risk devices. There are requirements for informed consent, labeling, monitoring, record keeping, and reports. The primary objective there is to protect the human subjects. It requires approval by an institutional review board, and for significant risk devices, we look at those protocols carefully. We have a 30-day window which to review these protocols. There are some combination products, so you're thinking about maybe putting a antimicrobial coating on your device or something like that. These often have bring on the combination product clause, which is when you combine a drug with a device, a biologic with the device. They can be physically linked, they can be packaged separately for use together, but these raise unique regulatory and scientific questions. And so on to the discussion for today, the clinical trials. Each of those pieces that we talked about are in a talk on themselves. Let me just go back one. So the outline of today's discussion is the clinical studies, what our regulatory framework is for clinical studies for applications outside of the United States, the importance of meeting with us before studies are conducted, and conduct of device studies in pediatric populations. Why are clinical studies important? They address regulatory requirements. In order for us to put a product on the market, there needs to be reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. We base our decisions on valid scientific evidence. We look at bench animal and human data. It's similar to the drug approval process for some of these. And I'm going to get a little more into that in the following slide. These provide information for practitioners because our ultimate product is labeling. The label allows whomever the manufacturer is to advertise their product for use by the surgeon, the medical specialist. And what goes into that label is the information that's provided to us for review, and we distill that into a label for a dissemination to the public. The other important piece for clinical studies is that when you conduct a study, it provides some direction for further development. It'd be unfortunate if you didn't learn from a clinical study as to what additional pieces are needed or what future direction you should be taking that into. And so even if your study fails, there's something valuable to be gained from that study as to why it failed. What's the problem? Was it a problem with the device? Was it a problem with my patient population selection, et cetera? And so important to think about those issues. Again, briefly went over this submission types that need clinical data. 510Ks, I mentioned 10% of those. HDEs, usually we need some sort of clinical information, and PMAs almost always. And if the clinical study is conducted in the United States, it's subject to the investigational device exemption provisions. The 510Ks, the degree of difference between the subject device and predicate can be explored in clinical data, so a active control type of study. Differences in design, new technology, new indications for use. We do look carefully at the ability of bench and animal testing to answer questions, but sometimes that's not enough, and those devices, some of these devices need clinical data. There are some examples where devices always need clinical data. For example, non-invasive blood pressure monitors, those all need them. And the 510K clinical studies are generally confirmatory. but not always. They can be proof of concept. They can be small sample sizes. They can be single arm, historically controlled. You can use peer-reviewed literature, articles, but the determination of what is appropriate is the FDA's. It's the job of the sponsor to try to convince us that a smaller study is sufficient, or a less arduous task of conducting a careful, controlled clinical study is not necessary. If the issues are more complex, we will let you know about the type of study that is needed. For pre-market approval, we try to establish reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. These are based on valid scientific evidence, as I mentioned previously. Clinical studies you can have multiple clinical studies leading up to a pre-market approval package. I believe in iterative development for medical products. Proof of concept and feasibility studies lead to phase 2 or dose ranging type of studies, and dose ranging applies to drugs, but it can also apply to devices. And then that leads to a pivotal study where you try to take into account exactly how is that device really going to be used when it gets out there, and what the patient population that you're targeting is going to be. Like I said, an iterative process is ideal for development of most products because it gets to the phase in of learning as you go. So the early studies will identify potential risks for those products, and you can learn from those studies and establish what safeguards you need to keep those risks out. Often we see products come in with who say, oh, we don't need a clinical study, but then when they do the clinical study, part of their device fails. The material that was used was not of sufficient strength, and they may need some metal instead of where plastic goes, and so they redesign the device, conduct their what's their pivotal study with the final device product, and go on to get approval. So valid scientific evidence, we have a good deal of latitude to work with within the definition from our regulation, which is 21 CFR 860.7. And there's the range of studies. It can be anywhere from well-controlled investigations to reports of significant human experience, but where your device falls is a determination that FDA makes. And it varies according to the characteristics of the device, the conditions of use, the existence and adequacy of warnings and other restrictions, and the extent of experience with the use of the product. So a little bit about conducting studies outside the United States. More and more device companies are going outside the US for their clinical studies, not having to deal with US IRBs perhaps, or not having to worry about regulations for conduct of their study and early feasibility studies. There are some pitfalls for that, and that go along with the advantages. Just briefly, the regs that go with that, study conducted under an IDE outside the US and submitted in support of the PMA still needs to comply with the IDE regulation 21 CFR 812. FDA will accept non-IDE studies conducted OUS if they're begun on or after 1986, and the data constitute valid scientific evidence, and the investigators conducted the studies in conformance with the Declaration of Helsinki, excuse me, or the laws and regulations of the country, whichever offers greater protection to the human subjects. If you recall, the Declaration of Helsinki was put in place post-World War II. The OUS data may allow for approval if the foreign data is applicable to the US population and medical practice. And that's a determination that FDA makes. Sponsors need to convince the FDA that that's the case. Is the standard of practice in that country the same? Are the drugs or alternative therapies available in that country the same? Is the educational level of the practicing physicians the same? The studies have been performed by clinical investigators of recognized competence, and the data may be considered valid without the need for an on-site inspection by FDA, or if FDA considers such an inspection to be necessary, that FDA can validate the data through an on-site inspection or other appropriate means. And I can tell you that we do send investigators overseas to look at data. Applicants who seek approval based solely on foreign data are encouraged to meet with us in a pre-submission meeting to carefully go over how those data are parsed, what sort of statistical analyses need to be done with those data. We may often ask, let's look at the data without that foreign data and look only at the US sites, and let's see how those match up with the foreign site data. So that gets us to meetings. Meetings with the FDA are encouraged. There's opportunity for early collaboration. These can be pre-submission, pre-IDE meetings. We are very happy to meet and discuss specific questions that arise during device development process. One of the most critical parts of the pre-market review process is making sure that we understand what you're doing and you understand the regulations by which U.S. drug device development occurs. At what point during the IDE development process should a pre-submission meeting be requested? At any time, but generally speaking, the earlier the better. There are various submission times for approval of with regards to clinical studies and animal studies and how those things are going to be submitted. What kinds of issues are appropriate for pre-submission meetings? There's a whole range of issues that we can talk about, but we usually don't like to review data for these meetings. The review of data comes with the application itself. You can present some information that would support a clinical study, in which case we'd be happy to look at your interpretation of that. Common clinical study issues discussed during pre-submission meetings include patient population, the sample size, statistical analysis plan, and it's important, this statistical analysis plan needs to be finalized before the conduct of the study. Hindsight is 20/20, but we like to have the plans in place before so that we can see what, to have a hypothesis generating study. And study endpoints need to be specified in the length and type of follow-up for these patients. And I'll get into a little bit about follow-up in a future slide. Preparing a pre-submission package includes device description, proposed indications for use, a summary of preclinical testing that's been done or proposed, and the clinical study plan. Come up with specific questions that you would like to discuss, and we'll get into a little bit about what kinds of questions are appropriate and what are not. Good questions are the preclinical study protocols adequate to provide sufficient preliminary evidence of safety to support the initiation of clinical study? Are the proposed trial design and selected control group appropriate? Is the proposed sample size calculation method and statistical analysis plan adequate for the proposed clinical study? Is the proposed follow-up period adequate for the proposed clinical study? There are some poor questions that we see, and we will tell you that we are not able to answer those questions. It could be, what are the clinical meaningful outcomes for the device, and what's the best way to analyze them? Those are things that sponsors need to be thinking about and propose to us what they think is the best way, and we will look at that. How large should the sample size be? Come up with your figures and provide them to us and support that, rather than asking us to try to generate it on our own without adequate data. How does FDA agree that the proposed clinical study protocol is adequate to support the safety and effectiveness of the device? That's sort of once you have the data, we'll make that determination. And does the FDA agree that the clinical results provided in the background package for the meeting are sufficient to support? That's another way of rephrasing that prior question, but again, that's a post-application type of question. So good pre-submission packages, it needs to be complete but not overly detailed. We recommend it to be as brief and as long as it needs to be, but of length that would allow us to review it. Remember, we get so many applications, so many meetings, that it's important to streamline your package so that it allows us to review it efficiently, and focus on the key questions for us and submit them well in advance of the meeting so that we have time to review those packages. Key pieces for your meeting with the FDA: leave enough time for discussion. You can assume that we all have reviewed your pre-submission materials and likely have had pre-meetings or multiple pre-meetings to discuss it. Keep an open mind, try not to come in with an entrenched position. Ask questions, ask us to explain why we're taking a certain position. We actually are in the process of working out new meeting processes where we will also generate our meeting summary, and the official meeting summary is the FDA meeting summary. But please do share your summary of meeting with us if available. Fully consider feedback you've received, and follow up with emails or further contact if you need further clarification. And if you don't agree with the recommendation that we give, you can always go up to the next level and appeal that decision. Don't skip the hierarchical levels, because that leads to it being pushed back anyway, and it's probably not in the. We don't like to see that when it's, for example, if you skip the division and come right to the office. So we approve devices for specific indications. Your clinical study design, these are with regard to how you design the clinical study, they should reflect the intended patient population. If you're not sure which patients will benefit the most, do a feasibility study and then design your pivotal study afterwards. Again, the process of iterative development, where you learn something from a smaller study before you go into a larger study. It's probably the most efficient use of resources, and it's a less risky approach. Your study must be designed to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of both safety and effectiveness. You'll generally need a primary safety endpoint and a primary effectiveness endpoint. And remember, we're looking at both safety and effectiveness, and your sample size calculation must address both of those. You should also remember that you may be required to conduct a post-approval study. So if you can build into your informed consent for your patients, we're going to do the surgery, but we want to follow you up for such a length of time, and we may have additional follow-up. Write that into informed consent so you're not chasing after those patients after they finish the study to meet additional requirements of a post-approval study should they arise. With regards to finally the unique nature of devices, some questions are better answered on the bench, stressing the failures, simulating long-term performance, evaluating histopathologic responses. So not all these types of questions are best answered in the clinical environment. And we recognize that, and you should recognize that as well. The last thing I want to talk about is pediatric populations. Our children are an underserved population with regards to devices. Children are not small adults, and taking a device and cutting it into smaller size is probably not the best interest for our children. We should actually have specific devices for those particular age ranges that are needed. And so a little bit of a reminder of how pediatric populations are defined. And this is subject to some difference from one party to another, but what is followed here is our regulation, which says anywhere up to 21 years of age is considered pediatric. But when we look at pediatric populations, we like to think of the whole range, and you need to have sufficient, if appropriate, sufficient information to address each of the age brackets that are described. With regards to evidence requirements for pediatric populations, we take into account the nature of the device, what's already known about the product in adults, what can be extrapolated about the device to pediatric populations, and thinking about the underlying disease or the condition being studied. We need to keep in mind that children are non-consenting populations, and that the age of consent is a legal issue. However, understanding the risk and benefit can be different among different stakeholders. We also need to consider growth, development, and future reproduction of children. The Pediatric Medical Device Safety and Improvement Act of 2007 requires applicants to have readily available information for pediatric subpopulations if they're appropriate. And a number of pediatric patients that suffer from the disease that your device is intended to treat, and we report to Congress annually regarding pediatric device submissions. And we may also order 522 or post-marketing studies for 510K devices and allow those to be longer than 3 years in length. There's also provision in that act for humanitarian devices exemptions to allow them to be marketed for profit, but we set an annual distribution limit for those devices. We also have a consortia grant. There are a few consortia being set up across the country for which we've given, it's on the order of millions of dollars to set up these consortia to foster and encourage device development in the pediatric arena. And we also are guided by our own pediatric advisory committee with regards to monitoring pediatric device development. So the summary is basically the 4 topics that I talked about. And thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I think we'll take them later. Great. Thank you. And cherry blossoms. We just had a beautiful spring, although brief, but very warm. Thank you.